Make a start, ladies and gentlemen. Welcome to our final event of this academic year, and thank you for brazing the drizzle and other depredations of the end of term and end of exam celebrations to be here. It's great to see so many of you. And it's also great to be sharing this event with the Margaret Beaufort Institute for Theology here in Cambridge. Thank you to Anna Abram for facilitating that. As many of you will know, this year and next we are exploring the theme of Catholicity, crises and opportunities, ? And there is so much to discuss that it will take us at least 2 years to start a meaningful conversation. At times, we've been finding more capacious understandings of Catholicity than have been recently in evidence. And at other times, like today, we are putting a spotlight on what might be considered constrictions of Catholicity, areas where the full impact of the idea of Catholicity is not being manifest or put to work in the church today around the world. Gender is clearly one of those areas. To shamelessly co-opt Judith Butler, it is clear that the church has gender trouble. Even prescinding from the knotty question of the ordination of women, it is clear that the church is struggling in many areas to even adequately represent, involve and cherish women in its institutional life and work. The new document on gender theory from the Congregation for Catholic Education, out this week, only confirms this. But discussions of this topic often degenerate quickly into polarized ping-pong and flag-waving. So we clearly need a more reflective and strategic kind of discussion to move in a constructive direction and think what resources the Church has and can deploy to ameliorate the situation. And that is what we're hoping for today. And our two distinguished guests are eminently suited to stimulating and leading us into this discussion. It's probably true, especially in this place, that Mary McAleese needs no introduction, but that would be a cop-out. Mary is an Honorary Fellow of St Edmund's College and a patron of both the Hügel Institute and the Margaret Beaufort Institute. Apart from those local and not inconsiderable distinctions, she was, of course, the 8th President of Ireland between 1997 and 2011. Prior to that, she was successively Professor of Criminal Law, Criminology and Penology at Trinity College, Dublin, then Director of the Institute of Professional Legal Studies at Queen's University, Belfast, and then Pro-Vice Chancellor of that university. She is now the Professor of Children, Law and Religion at the University of Glasgow. Since leaving the office of President, she has also, strikingly and interestingly, been studying canon law, and has gained several degrees in that field and published a study of collegiality in canon law. She is a well-known and vigorous commentator on all things Catholic, and particularly concerned with the representation and inclusion of marginalized groups within the Church. Mary has received many distinctions, from the Tipperary Peace Prize in 2012 along with her husband, to having a bridge named after her for her huge in Reconciliation. Sister Gemma Simmonds, a member of the Congregation of Jesus, is a well-known theologian in the UK and indeed around the world. An alumna of this college, Gemma is an historical and pastoral theologian who taught for many years at Heathrow College until its much regretted closure. But the silver lining has been that she is now mainly, though mainly doesn't mean often enough yet, mainly located in Cambridge as Senior Lecturer in Pastoral Theology and Director of the Religious Life Institute at the Margaret Beaufort Institute for Theology. Gemma is also a sought-after spiritual director and commentator on the media about spiritual and religious matters, as well as having been a prison chaplain for 26 years. Thank you both for agreeing to have this important conversation. We have been hugely looking forward to it. Practicalities. Mary and Gemma will have a conversation for about 45 minutes, and we're here to eavesdrop. We'll then pause for a few minutes to gather our thoughts, shake our legs, stand up, whatever, and then have about 20 to 30 minutes for questions and comments from the audience. And then we'll carry on the conversations more informally over a drink. And today, because it's our last event and we've got our distinguished guests, there's even going to be canapés. Finally, may I draw your attention to the obvious. We will be taking some photos and video of today's event. If you would rather not appear on that coverage, please speak to me or to Lydia, who's at the back, and we will ensure that is the case. So that's more than enough from me. Please welcome Mary McAleese and Gemma Simmonds to discuss Catholicity and Gender.
Well, Mary, it's a huge honour to be here, and I received a WhatsApp message earlier this afternoon saying, "What are you doing this afternoon?" So I messaged back saying, "I'm talking to the former President of Ireland on Catholicity and Gender." There was a pause and the message came back, "No pressure there then." And there isn't any pressure, and I think particularly of something that was said by Mary Ward, the founder of my congregation, in 1617. There is no such difference between men and women, that women may not do great things. And I think you're the living embodiment of what Mary Ward meant. I don't imagine in 1617 she thought very much about presidents of anywhere, and certainly not female presidents of anywhere. I think she'd have been thrilled skinny to know that there was a woman such as yourself as the head of state in Ireland. But here we are talking about Catholicity and Gender, the day after this document came out from the Dicastery for Education. And I'd like to quote something from it at the beginning. It talks about the need to educate children and young people to respect every person in their particularity and difference, so that no one should suffer bullying, violence, insults, or unjust discrimination based on their specific characteristics, such as special needs, race, religion, sexual tendencies, etc. So far, so very hopeful. But I wonder if you found the rest of the document hopeful. I wonder where you find yourself regarding what Catholic teaching has to say to the very vexed debate of the sorts of questions that we were hearing about concerning gender and concerning sexuality.
Well, it's a very new document. It's just really hot off the press, and I have a number of questions really arising out of it. I spent this morning, and so hello everybody. I spent this morning writing to Father Becchina in the Congregation for Catholic Education to get clarification, because I'm at one level it looks to me as if the target enemy in the document is the Church talking to those who support a very extreme form of gender ideology. That's what seems to me to be, that they're the enemy, if you like, in the document. And the Church taking a view that those who support a particularly extreme form of gender ideology want to essentially create the notion that gender is a matter of choice. It's not to do with nature. To use the language is quite stark in the document. I mean, it talks about that these people want to annihilate the family. It talks about people who want to have a world where gender has essentially disappeared as a concept. Now, my worry in that, I find the document deeply worrying, because I know that many people, particularly from the lesbian and gay community, will be looking at that document and going, well, hang on a minute, what does that say about being homosexual? I've been involved with the gay community since 1976. I was a founder member in Ireland of the Campaign for Homosexual Law Reform, because I took a very strong view then, in association with a gay colleague in Trinity College, David Norris, that this was actually a human rights issue, and the issue of the rights of gay people is a human rights issue. I, as a heterosexual and somebody who believed in human rights, should be involved in that, and we set up the campaign on that basis, that it was a joint endeavour between the gay community and the heterosexual community around a human rights issue. Now, in those 40 years, I have never met anyone, including my own brother who's gay and my son who is gay. I have actually never met anyone who has said to me, or who has been, who conforms to the view of a gender ideologue as set out in the Vatican's document. My son is a man. he is married to a man, end of. And he believes, as many gay people do, that this is his nature. This is the nature given to him by the God in whom he believes and whom he believes loves him. He doesn't want to annihilate the family. He thinks the family is great, and he's very appreciative of the family he comes from and the protections that go with being family to each other. So I wrote to Father Bekina today to ask him to clarify, is the ordinary, everyday gay man, gay woman, are they included in does the church believe that they are part of this menacing, threatening gender ideology? And if the church does believe that, it should have said that in the document. The document is fairly terse in that regard. I think it needs to be clear. And if it doesn't mean that, it also certainly needs to say it in the document. It's a document really of, I think Father James Martin put it very well, it's a document that discusses things between theologians, but doesn't really discuss things with scientists or indeed with people who are living this experience of, you know, being lesbian, gay, transgender, bisexual, intergender, whatever the terminology is. And I think that's a pity, because if you're going to launch a document of that type, which, let's face it, is going to be hugely influential. Let's remind ourselves, the Catholic Church is the biggest NGO in the world, bar none, offering educational and welfare and health services to children. There is nobody on the planet matches the work that is done by the Catholic Church, and to a large extent that work is excellent. But there's also the issue of influence and what is carried down the conduits of influence to the children in its care. It educates 16 million children worldwide in 200,000 schools. In my country alone, 90% of all primary schools are Catholic schools, 60% of all second-level schools are Catholic schools. So the reach of that influence is huge. And we have to be very careful, whether it's as parents, as educators, as politicians, as simply people who care, that what our children hear is not going to skew their lives or damage their lives. I mean, I have direct experience, as the brother, as the sister and the mother of gay children going to Catholic schools, of homophobia, of homophobic bullying. And I regret to say that when the church says that it really wants people to be treated with dignity and respect, and that it disavows bullying, I have to say, well, but you also have to ask yourself the question, is there anything in what you're doing or saying that could possibly conduce to homophobia, could open up other people to thinking it's okay to be homophobic? I mean, if, for example, you describe a person's sexual orientation as intrinsically disordered, as the Catholic Church does, can you be surprised then when somebody translates that into queer or fag or whatever the epithet is? That's my problem, is the linkage. I mean, I could make the same distinction, for example, with that you've just recently had a very big visitor here from the United States. We had him too, Donald Trump. And something about what he says, the kind of language that he uses, empowers people to speak in disrespectful ways, whether it's cross gender lines or race lines. Now, he himself would disavow that, I'm perfectly sure. But the reality is that what you say and how you say it has consequences, and the church is a major influencer. But there's a very important paragraph in that document. I think it's opened up a discussion that will be a good discussion for the church. It's not a very well written document. It's a bit tedious, to be honest. It's intellectually quite infantile.
Well, it's a kind of compilation.
It's infantile.
Isn't it, really?
Yeah, it's the kind of old. But honestly, there's the very fact that it talks about dialogue. I think great. Let's have the dialogue. Let's have the discussion. I think that's wonderful. One of Francis's strengths is the willingness to engage in dialogue. But there's a paragraph at the end of it that is really, from my point of view, I think it's going to be particularly pertinent in my country, because it says that the church is of the view that children should not be exposed only to one point of view. Now, clearly what the church is trying to avoid happening is the children being subjected to the kind of gender ideology that the church opposes. But you can also put the argument straight back in the church. In the context of my country, we can say, well, yes, we agree with that. And for that reason, maybe we need to look more closely at reducing the level of patronage of Catholic schools, or ensuring that in terms of curriculum, the children have access to a variety of opinions and views and perspectives, so that they can, in time, with help and guidance and support, make up their own minds.
So, I mean, I think one of the difficulties is that the church would hold that its teaching about the human person is not just an opinion. Okay. That it holds, to a certain extent, it's an attempt to unfold and explain revelation. It's also an attempt to unfold and explain and be creative with a very long-standing tradition, which of course in itself has changed, because our understanding of the human person has changed over the centuries. And so I think of myself, who have spent most of my life as a Catholic educator. Here I am, I no longer teach children, but were I to still be in a school, I would want to be, more than anything else, ensuring that anyone who came out of a school I ran held as absolutely central that they are created and loved by God at all times, in all circumstances. That would be my kind of bottom line. Out of that, I would be trying to explain a Catholic teaching which is profoundly non-dualistic and therefore sees the body, the human body, as integral to the human person and our understanding of personhood. I would also be trying to help any child growing to understand that there are differences of personal experiences of what it is to be male, female, to be a human person. Holding to Catholic teaching and yet being open to society and society's view about these things. And also today, holding to the fact that we now live, certainly in Britain, in a country where same-sex marriage is legal. That's an awful lot of plates to spin all at the same time. So where would you be talking to a Catholic educator, say, as the mother of a gay son, the sister of a gay brother, a legislator, about how we put this together in a way that is faithful to lived and experienced reality, but also faithful to a body of teaching which is not merely an opinion?
That body of teaching, I have to say, some of it is wrong. Simple as that. The Church itself has a long history of saying that some of its teaching is wrong. Not everything that comes down the 2,000-year conduit is still with us today. There are many, many, many examples of teachings that were held to for centuries, which the Church has quietly backed out of. We could list them all out. I'm sure this audience could come up. We could put up a chart and we'd probably between us come up with several hundred. And so I think we have to be very careful not to play the game of suggesting that there is a 2,000-year-old rock-solid tradition, a block of solid teaching, which is in all circumstances and all times has always been absolutely true. So, but for example, there are core doctrines which I think belong to the Christian tradition and to the Catholic tradition. The divinity of Christ, the fact that Christ existed, his existence, the fact that he is and he was sacrificed. He gave this extraordinary, extravagant sacrifice for my soul and yours to enter, so that we could enter into eternal salvation. The beauty of that story, the beauty of the sacrifice, the gratuitous nature of it, the gift of it, all of that. But then you start adding on, over the centuries, all the other stuff. Like, for example, let me just take you back to the early part of the 19th century, early part of the 20th century, not that far away. Let me give you maybe 2 documents. I think of Tra le Sollicitudine. Women can't sing in church choirs. Right. Grand. Women can't sing. Women are not permitted to sing in church choirs. Right. Now, very rightly, the American church at that time wrote to the Vatican and said something like, "Are you kidding me?" Like, why? And little by little, that just evaporated off the face of the earth. There is no document anywhere that actually says "tra le sollicitudine" was wrong. Because they never do that sort of thing, with the exception of Galileo. Very rarely does the church actually say, "You know what, we got that totally wrong." They just quietly sneak away from stuff that gets to be preposterously embarrassing, like women can't sing in church, are not permitted to sing in church. Why? Because the choirs were allegedly then regarded as a form of minor orders. Believe it or not. There you go now.
That's interesting.
There's an interesting. Anyway, so that's one thing. Let me fast forward then to Casti Connubii, Pius XI, talking about women and about the idea that women and men are equal and entitled to be regarded as equal. And he says of that it's a false doctrine. A false doctrine. Why? Because if you read Casti Connubii, he characterizes the relationship between men and women as one of submission of the woman to the man. And the man will always treat the woman with the dignity, the equality of dignity to which she is entitled, provided that she, of course, in turn submits in obedience to the overarching magisterium of the man. Now, again, honestly, I don't think the church goes around saying that kind of stuff terribly very much nowadays. And in particular, if you move on a generation to more than a generation, 2 generations to John the 23rd, and to probably absolutely the best encyclical of the 20th century, which was Pacem Terrace. Completely overlooked, largely forgotten, was designed to be hugely influential at the Vatican Council. And Pacem Terrace lists the signs of the times and the rights, a bunch of rights, human rights, that the Pope believed should be inserted into the internal world of the Church. And he says emphatically that 2 of the signs of the times that he notices in particular, and he's noticing them with a new openness. One is freedom of expression, conscience and belief, which has to have a role in the Church, he believes. And he believes there needs to be a dialogue about that. And the other is the role of women. And he says, that the days of treating women in subordinate roles, the days of treating women as second class, including in the church, are over. And that document, I think for me, it's the best encyclical of the 20th century. And it's still sitting there, waiting to be the leaven in thinking that it never has been. It never really got the heft, the momentum that was required at the Second Vatican Council. It ended up being it was like so many things, it was not the document itself was a disappointment, but how it eventually was translated through the Council into and interpreted, essentially by canon lawyers, into the 1983 Code of Canon Law. It becomes weakened, it doesn't be the leaven, So look, I don't believe for one moment that there is this extraordinary I hear it so often that the church has this 2,000-year tradition that it must adhere to. And I say, well, hang on a minute, let's just examine that now. Is it genuinely 2,000 years, or was it last year? Or was it last century, or the century before? I take a very simple example. Up until 1870, for the 1,000 years up to 1870, the church was both a spiritual kingdom and a secular empire. The Pope was an emperor of the Papal States. And if you examine the teaching of the relationship between church and state, it's there in black and white. You see it in Pope Pius IX's writings, that the alliance between church and state that God intends is that the Catholic Church would be the temporal leader and, in other words, the secular leader and the spiritual leader of the entire world. That the idea of the separation of church and state is anathema. And that we listen to this now and we look at it and think, oh dear God, I'm mortified to read that now. So embarrassed to read that now. But that was the teaching of the church up until 1870. In fact, it was the teaching of the church until well into the 20th century. Because of course, in 1878, Pius IX dies, but by then the papal states are gone. And the old secular empire of the church is gone. But the thinking of what I might call the imperial thinking, that relationship between a very, very stratified hierarchical system, you know, with a vast army of serfs below, you know, paying homage to the monarch, to the emperor, who is divinely ordained by God to be emperor. That was the structure. And we have to remember that it wasn't until 1929 that the church clearly accepted, that it was never going to get back the papal states. With the creation of the Lateran treaties and the carving out of the city of Rome of the tiny little golf course size state which is known as the Vatican City State. Most people think the Vatican City State has existed since St. Peter, you know, was running around the Vatican. It was created in 1929. And I'm always amazed actually at our ignorance about our own church and about our church's teaching and how quickly we accept sort of shibboleths like, you know, 2,000 years of tradition.
Well, let's look at that for a second. It seems to me that, you know, even when there have been apparently very kind of monolithic strands in the church, there has always been an element of the charismatic, of the creative, of the prophetic, very often within religious orders, the likes of Dominic, Francis, Ignatius, Mary Ward, Catherine Corley, all sorts of people who have called from the peripheries, as it were, to the centre for something more contextual, more predicated on the reality of people's lives. And there's, in that respect, I think there always has been a dialogue. Sometimes the dialogue has been more successful than others. There was a mention earlier of Galileo. Galileo and Mary Ward were arrested and imprisoned at the same time. The church has put up a statue to Galileo and given him a formal apology.
I'm sure he's thrilled.
The sisters of the Congregation of Jesus are not holding their breath quite yet, because I'm not sure that the women are going to get the apology quite yet. But equally, it seems to me that there is a momentum in the church that's always been alert to context, and the conversation between context on the one hand and theological definition on the other is what makes theology creative and what makes an area for pastoral theology and, at its best, the practice of canon law to take place in a way that actually works for people. So where can we go? You know, it would be very easy for you and me, I think, to set up various Aunt Sally's for an afternoon and knock the Catholic Church for six in those respects. But it does seem to me that the Catholic Church and Catholic teaching about the human person, about personhood, has got an important thing to say today about human dignity and about the fact that human sexuality and gender are not merely constructs. I was talking to you earlier before we started this conversation about a situation I came across. I was chaplain to Holloway Prison, Europe's largest women's prison, for 26 years. And at one point, we had a man who demanded entry because he self-identified as a woman. Well, there are many, many women in that prison who have been raped and sexually abused since childhood. And they would also have a right not to live in a space where they felt threatened by a male presence, even though that male, though biologically, physically intact as a male, self-identified as a woman. The same has happened in other institutions where women have created what they consider to be a reserved and safe space for themselves. And this space is now being contested by those who, in the name of gender ideology, are saying it is a sort of a fascist way of going about things to insist that you can only claim to be female if you have external female sexual characteristics. And I suspect that at least some of this dialogue in the church is trying to say, you know, we've got to have something to say about gender that is not merely about saying it's a construct to do with society, it's a construct to do with how I actually personally feel, what I personally aspire to, or how I've been conditioned by society. So where do we find a creative space in the middle of that, do you think?
Just let me go back to the start of that, because it's interesting that you would talk about the role of the religious orders as bastions of debate, spaces where...
I'm not sure I'd use the word bastion,
but spaces where debate happened.
Yeah.
And happened traditionally. I mean, your own foundress, going back to the 17th century, and there are a number of them, a number of founders of religious orders, women's religious orders who one could name, who stood against their own times. But that actually is quite a telling analogy, because in those days and in those times, those women were of their nature, well, not so much of their nature, of their circumstance, we find that they were usually well-to-do women. They were women who had an education. They were women who had some. They weren't just extraordinary in what they accomplished, but if you look at their social circumstances, they were also to some extent extraordinary. They very rarely were the poor, or the uneducated. So you would expect that cohort to have, you know, this was the cohort in which ideas bubbled, and in which the strictures very often, or the constraints of churches, by which I mean by centralised controlling clerical church castes, made their lives quite difficult. They were determined to push out those boundaries. They were, as we would expect academics to be, people who took the boundaries and gave them a shake to see would they hold, and hoped that they could push them a little bit further. And they were doing that, of course, in the interest of their view and perspective on the gospel. What's happening in our time is really a very, very extreme and extenuated version of that, because always alongside that there was the sensus fidelium, the people, the voice of the people, the lived experience of the faithful. The big difference between the faithful now and the faithful, say, of my grandparents' generation 2 days ago is the big word education. Education. My parents left school at 14 and 15 because there was no access to free second-level education. My generation, on the other hand, had access to both of those, free second level, and free. Do you remember those great days of free second level and free third level education? So we were a different generation, and thanks very often to the massification of education that was promoted by the religious orders, we were equipped with tools that made our, if you like, sensus fidelium a lot more interrogative, a lot more critiquing, a lot more intelligent in dealing with the doctrines that we were now being asked to submit to, in submitting to our sacred pastors as the people who decided what was the content of the teaching magisterium of the church. And so we're in a different ballgame now altogether. We have generations who are rights literate. They are rights litigious. They expect that if they have freedom of conscience, religion, belief and opinion in secular law, then surely they must have it in divine law, because where did these rights come from? These are human rights. We would call them rights, some people might call them rights that derive from the dignity of the human person thanks to the natural law, by virtue of being human. No government gives you them. No government concedes them to you. All governments are obliged to respect them. Not all do, but all are obliged to respect them and vindicate them. But these are rights, you and I would say they're God-given. These are God-given rights. Now, as intelligent, lay people, reasonably well educated, are we not entitled to say to our church, do you see those rights now? Because our church was very instrumental in bringing about the Universal Declaration of Human Rights. It was the Catholic Bishops' Conference, the American Catholic Bishops' Conference, God help us, that wrote to boy, have times changed, wrote to Eleanor Roosevelt back in 1941 and said, please develop a framework for human rights. It was Pius XII who appealed for a world organisation that would take the work of the League of Nations and put it on a different plane. That was the big push that came and got behind the United Nations. So our church has a good reputation when it comes to in more recent times, developing the concept of human rights. It would be true to say that up until Leo XIII, Rerum Novarum, that great encyclical, that the Church for centuries was utterly, hopelessly antipathetic to the idea of individual human rights. It saw what happened in the French Revolution. It feared for its property. It feared for its place in the world. And so there was that hostility to individual human rights. There was always the tendency to think of us as a church of communio. Castillo Lara, the late Cardinal Castillo Lara, put it that we're a church that is about, we don't litigate. We don't go to courts to vindicate our rights within the church. We submit in obedience to the magisterium of the church. Well, actually, I don't think we do anymore, honestly. I think we're probably entitled to say about our sacred pastors that they are like a curate's egg. They're a mixed bag. They have been fantastic in some respects. Some of them are admirable, and doctrinally they have given us a rich legacy. I think particularly of the legacy in relation to Catholic social teaching in the economic sphere and in the climate sphere, particularly of Francis, talking about immigrants, talking about people who build walls to stop God's human beings in desperation from looking for help, pushing out the realm of Catholic social teaching to include responsibility for the environment. I think that, and the economic words of Francis, which honestly, he's been accused of being a communist, he's been accused of being a mad socialist. You look at what he says, it is no different to what was said in Rerum Novarum, it is no different to what was said in Quadragesimo Anno or Centesimo Anno, nothing different. These are generations apart, and it's that is tradition, that is a straight line. Okay, it's only about 120 years old, but it is a straight line of a watershed moment in Catholicity, when the Church came out wholeheartedly in favour of the human rights of the poor and the human rights of women and children. Just check the text of Rerum Novarum. A consciousness that women are particularly vulnerable, that children are particularly vulnerable, and God sees it, and God doesn't want that vulnerability to be exploited. And that's there. I think Francis is brilliant on that. But then there's a problem, because in the same moment that we are dealing with economic rights, we are also developing autonomous human rights to things like freedom of conscience, freedom of religion, freedom to change religion. It's there, it's in the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, it's there in the Convention on the Rights of the Child. Our Holy See is a state party to the Convention on the Rights of the Child. Didn't have to be. Nope, it's the only faith system in the entire world that is a state party to the Convention on the Rights of the Child, and indeed to the Convention on the Elimination of Racial Discrimination. No other faith system in the world has permanent representative status at the United Nations. Why does it have that? It has that because the United Nations recognises This organisation, the Catholic Church, operates on 5 continents. It is highly influential. It has a huge body of experience at the United Nations and a huge reach of conduits that the United Nations values and uses on a daily basis, on a regular basis. But with that there comes a responsibility that if the Holy See, as it does, wants to be a permanent representative of the United Nations, if it wants, as it does, to be a state party to the Convention on the Rights of the Child, it has signed up to implement the principles of that convention in its jurisdiction. Now, what is its jurisdiction what is its jurisdiction in relation to children? Anybody have a guess at it? What is its jurisdiction? How many child members are there of the Catholic Church? Anybody want to hazard a guess? How many child members, that is under 18, are members of the Catholic Church? What? Between 300 and 400 million. Between 300, that's a lot of kids. That's a lot of influence. How did they become members? Any of you have seen the film, Mary Queen, the recent Mary Queen of Scots film? Anybody seen it here? Well, if you had, I went to see it with my kids. The odd Friday night we go as a family to this place called the Lighthouse in Dublin. They show really great films. So we're there and going to see Mary Queen of Scots. And the first thing that you see on the screen is text. And here's the opening line. Mary Queen of Scots was born a Catholic. Right. And I'm looking at that and I nudge my husband and I say, that is theologically, juridically and canonically balderdash. It's actually not true. Nobody ever is born a Catholic. It's not possible. So I'm busy saying that and my husband, and down the line, and my son Justin reaches across and he says, Mum, we're all theologically literate and canonically literate in this row. Shut the hell up. So we can watch the film. So I did
so
that.
Nice when your children appreciate
I know, they're wonderful. And I was glad, in fact, that they at least admitted to being theologically and canonically literate and that they had got the point. Imagine all the research that went into that blessed film and the opening line is a heap of junk. Why is it a heap of junk? We're not born Catholic. Here's how we become Catholic. We're baptized. We're baptized in the Catholic Church, and that has, if you like, just think of a rope, with many we'll say with 2 strands in this case. There's a theological strand to baptism, which is extraordinarily beautiful, and there is a juridic strand, a legal, man-made strand, not quite so beautiful, just a little bit more prosaic, shall we say. The theological one is fantastic because that is where the child, because of course the Catholic Church's canon law insists on infant baptism. It is the norm. 84% of all Catholics worldwide became Catholics at baptism when they were babies. That's the rule. In Ireland it's probably about 99%. I don't know what it would be here, but I imagine it's pretty hefty too here. So we take non-sentient babies, there they are, you're praying to God they won't even waken up and disgrace you in front of the neighbours and squeal the church down. There they are, they have the soother, and that's usually the granny's role. Was in my case. My daughter was never going to have soothers for her children because she's a freaking dentist. I said to her, actually, precisely because you're a dentist, you can afford to have the soothers because whatever damage it does, you can undo it then later. If there is any evidence to the fact that it causes damage, in my view, then that damage to parents' frayed nerves just justifies soothers right, left and centre. Speaking as the oldest of 9 children, the mother of 3. And here you have a situation where we have the child being baptized. And what are the consequences of that baptism? Now, you are incorporated into the body of Christ. That's one of the great gifts that Christ gave us. And original sin is expunged. And in the expunging of original sin, you now have the distinct possibility of entering eternal life. Because our church still teaches that the child that dies unbaptized does not have the certainty of that prospect. It's a dreadful thing to have done to parents, but there it is. Our church teaches that the unbaptized child cannot be certain of eternal salvation. Ironically, if that child was 7 years old and had the use of reason and was in the catechumenate, was not a Catholic, and was studying to become a Catholic, is in the catechumenate, say, doing the RCIA program. That child, if it dies unbaptized, has the prospect of eternal life through what this, you would know better than me, this baptism by desire, the fiction of baptism, or not the fiction, but the construct of baptism by desire. So we have a situation where we have the wonderful theological consequences, and these operate by the grace of God, the grace of Christ, no matter what we do. That grace is entering our lives and filling and fueling our lives, no matter what we do, think or say for the rest of our lives. But here's the juridic bit. The juridic consequence of baptism is that on the day we're baptized, we also become enrolled, according to canon law, as members for life of the Catholic Church. Now, if you examine the Code of Canon Law, which is the Church's legal system that prevails right across the universal Church, it says that children, and not just children, but all members of the Church, have a number of rights, and that they have a number of obligations. A lot of obligations, not so heavy on the rights, but very heavy on the obligations. Those obligations kick in for children at the age of 7 when they reach the use of reason. 7 with the use of reason. There's a kind of a rebuttable presumption that at the age of 7 you've reached the use of reason. It mightn't happen in every case, and if it doesn't happen in every case, that individual kid is fine, not regarded as having reached the use of reason, but at 7. And our entire, in the case of Ireland, I can't speak for England, but our Catholic school system is predicated upon at the age of 7, they reach the use of reason, so you're into preparation for First Penance and First Communion, because First Penance and First Communion are also predicated upon reaching the use of reason. This is important. Why? Because at the age of 7 with the use of reason, you are now obliged to follow all the ecclesial rules set out in the Code of Canon Law, ecclesiastical law. This is man-made law, could change tomorrow morning. Laws that say you've got to go to Mass every Sunday, they could change that tomorrow and say, once a year is fine. They could do that tomorrow. Because actually, in fairness, Christ did not leave that along with all the other stuff he left us. He didn't leave us. This is a bunch of rules made by men, aggregated over years. One of those rules is that when we reach the age of discretion, which again a papal document tells us is roughly around the same age as the use of reason, which is roughly around the age of 7, then you're obliged to confess once a year your grave sins. Grave sins are mortal sins, they're not venial sins now. We're talking serious stuff here now. We're not talking venial sins, we're talking really serious breaches of the moral law. And we say to children at the age of 7, you're now obliged to confess these children. What is, in my view, really very problematic here is where does our Church get the right to impose on non-sentient children lifelong obligations which, when they're undertaken, when they're imposed as members at baptism, they have no notion what they are, they can't evaluate them, they can't say, well actually I object, because they are non-sentient. And here we have what I might call an absolutely fundamental basis of church membership that has never ever been interrogated from the point of view of the rights of that child to choose whether it wishes to be obliged or not. Because never again, as a Catholic, will it be given the opportunity to say, I accept or I reject these obligations. Now some people will say, oh well, don't you, in confirmation, don't you renew your baptismal promises? Well, renewal is an interesting word, because it presumes that you actually said them in the first place. And in the case of the vast majority of children or people, that is not true. And the second problem here is that if you look at, and we often, during the course of the year, there are certain rituals in which we also renew our baptismal promises. As if we could stay silent, and in not speaking, we don't make the obligation again. But in fact, these things are these are mere ritual, and they have no formal or canonical or legal validity in the eyes of the church. If you walk away from the church, if you forswear the obedience to the Pope, if you deny certain very crucial doctrines in the church, you commit the offences of heresy, of apostasy, of schism. They're there in canon law. We break canon law. There are penalties for so doing. Excommunication follows as night follows day. And many other penalties may come. For example, you could lose your job in an institute like this. So my problem here is that we have never really, to go back to that two strands thing, we have always run the two strands so tightly together that they appear to be one. And now in the world that we are in, which has a developing rights consciousness that starts really with the Universal Declaration of Human Rights and has burgeoned ever since. And the example you gave, you know, of the lads trying to get into the ladies' pool, is, you know, a really very extenuated, probably, example of where that rights dialogue takes us. And I think dialogue very often can take you into ridiculous places and specious places, but then it comes back to, it finds a balance. And in finding that balance, things change. And I think that the future kind of debates that we're likely to have in the church are in and around that fundamental question as to whether the church has that right to impose obligations on the non-sentient, and whether it should in fact treat our children not to the catechesis of obligation which baptised babies get in Catholic school, but to the same kind of catechesis, or an equivalent catechesis of invitation that we offer to catechumens. Because the truth of the matter is, they can walk away anyway. And if we keep telling them, here's what you must believe, when in the background noise in their head they're saying, actually, I don't have to believe any of this stuff. I've got freedom of opinion, conscience and belief. I mean, who are they to tell me I must?
I have to say, as somebody who spent quite a lot of her life teaching adolescents, if I had at any point ever attempted to say to a stroppy 15-year-old, you must believe this, I would not have got away with my life. I think there are very few Catholic educators who would do that now with any sense of getting anywhere.
Why does Catholic canon law then still say it?
Yeah. Because I think
why has the law not changed?
Because law deals, does it not, in a sense, in absolutes, in order to try and lay down a framework for people to contextualise things. I think that is the same to a very large extent in civil law, which tries to, the thing about law is it tries to formulate things in a way that makes them watertight. And we know that human beings are very leaky. That's part, I think, of the problem. I'm also looking at the fact that time is leaky, and that in this fascinating conversation we have come virtually to the end of our time and our conversation. I suppose if I were to go back and take us back to the document that we began this conversation on, I'm a young Catholic teacher in a Catholic school. I'm wanting to help young people to understand something about gender, about human sexuality, and about the uniqueness of the human person created by God, which ultimately is the goal of Catholic teaching about human personhood. What is the best thing that the Catholic faith can give me to help young people understand themselves, as it says in Psalm 139, as fearfully and wonderfully made by God?
I think one of the best expressions of the idea of the God who loves and embraces came in a very simple phrase from Francis when he was asked about gay people, for example, and he simply said, "Who am I to judge?" And many people's hearts lifted when they heard that, because this was the God that I believe in, the God who's going to embrace, the God who's going to hug, the God who's going to love you, who's not going to call you the queer, the faggot, the whatever, all the names that my son and my brother have had to endure, and many more. But it's also true in many other spheres. The idea of leave it to God to do the judging. We human beings, you know, we're pretty poor judges, in truth. And again, it's so much easier to cast our, you know, to see the problem with the other person, and not to turn the critical eye on ourselves. So I like that, and I think that the dialogue that opened up, even though, you know, that in two days later, you know, or maybe a day later, that was it Lombardi went out to, you know, in front of the press to say, well, actually, what he really meant was Catholic teaching hasn't changed, but at the same time, the words were said, and once they were out there, they were in the ether, and they had spores that were now multiplying virally all around the world. And those words keep coming back. People keep saying to the church, yeah, but you do judge. Now, hang on a minute. You said you weren't going to, but now you are doing it. And this is what I mean about canon law. You've described a situation where, as an educator, you would never lay down the law as it is in canon law to young people. And I'm delighted to hear that, because I think it's one of the great strengths of some of the Catholic schools in Ireland, at least, that they have moved beyond hitting people over the head with rule books. But that said, nonetheless, the law is there. And when I look again and I think that, yes, keep the debate open, keep the dialogue going, but at the same time as you and I are talking, I mentioned the Committee on the Rights of the Child. The Holy See was an early state party to the Convention on the Rights of the Child. In fact, it was a Catholic priest, Canon Joe Merman from Belgium, who really pushed the idea of the convention. He was a huge champion of children. The Holy See, not just as individual, was deeply involved in drafting what we call the travaux préparatoires. These are the preparatory documents leading to the convention, completely involved, knew every jot and tittle, every I that was dotted, every T that was crossed. No body on the face of the earth was better prepared to become a state party to that convention in the Catholic Church. And the fact that it did so, I think, is hugely to its credit. But here's what happened. Under that convention, you have to make reports, you know, every 5 years to a committee. You make them in writing. Then the committee asks you questions about them. Then you make another report in writing. Then you go to Geneva, and they ask you questions in an open forum. So the Catholic Church isn't used to this kind of idea. I mean, it's always regarded itself as hermetically sealed, a perfect society, accountable to nobody. And so it engages with the Committee on the Rights of the Child, and the very first outing with them is terribly twee. Nobody asks anything, nothing is difficult. It's all terribly nice and grand. And buried in the bottom of the report is a tiny paragraph that refers to the Vatican city-state as a mere workplace for clerics. In other words, the Vatican acknowledges that when it signed this document, this treaty, it did so on behalf of two bodies. The Holy See, that governs the lives of Catholics worldwide with its own system of laws and its doctrines, and then this tiny little golf course-sized state. So it's just making the point that, you know, don't even bother talking about the Vatican city-state because it's irrelevant. That was then, that was 1995. And we all know what happened post-1995. We had all the clerical sex abuse scandals and the episcopal mismanagement scandals. So when the Vatican goes back for the next round of talks, it's a different ballgame. The Committee on the Rights of the Child are waiting for them with guns loaded, ready to blast them, you know, into the stratosphere. You know, what about the Magdalene laundries? What about the priesthood move? What about heterosexuality and homosexuality? What about women in the church? Dear Lord, a litany of stuff. And the Catholic Church takes one look at this and goes, oh dear, oh, how are we going to handle this now? And what then happens is they don't make a report for 12 years. Yeah. While they kind of think, how are we going to do this now? And when they come back to the committee, here is what they say. They say, and this is 25 years after ratifying the treaty, they say, actually, the treaty requires a territory in which to be implemented. The only territory we have is the Vatican city-state, and we acknowledge we must implement there. And over the summer of 2013, we changed the law to bring it into line with the convention, because we discovered there are children in the Vatican city-state, 36 of them, or 37 of them to be. Don't ask me. I have no idea how they got there. But anyway, I do, because one of them, what started this whole thing, if you remember, there was a gentleman called Paolo Gabrielli. He was Benedict's butler, who took documents, stole documents, and it became a cause célèbre. And in the course of coverage of his story, we discovered that he lived in the Vatican, and so did his children. So people like me wrote to the Committee on the Rights of the Child and said, excuse me, but the next time you're talking to them, when the Holy See gets around to making its report, would you please ask them what's going on in the Vatican city-state? So anticipating that, and they then go back to the committee and say, we are now prepared to implement the treaty in the Vatican city-state. Now bear in mind, they have made 2 reports on that treaty and about 18 reports on the Committee on Racial Discrimination. And they are quite copious documents. There are pages and pages and pages dedicated to implementation of the principles of the treaty within church teaching and doctrine and canon law, and long lists of canons that have been changed, long lists of doctrines that are being looked at again, like teaching on corporal punishment, like teaching on illegitimacy. They have agreed to do all that, and suddenly, 25 years later, they say, actually, do you see all those times we talked about those things? They were actually outside the mandate of the Committee on the Rights of the Child, because we're a spiritual body and we don't have a territory except the Vatican city-state. We've no obligation to implement the treaty within canon law or church teaching. In other words, we'll implement it for 35 children in Vatican city-state. We will not implement it for the 300 to 400 million children who are members of the Catholic Church. And that's the position they now hold. The Committee on the Rights of the Child has rightly said back to them, not in so many, but it said to them, are you serious? 25 years later, suddenly you're telling us that all the discussions that we have had, and incidentally, many of the discussions were spontaneously raised by the Holy See and not initiated by the committee at all. Like, for example, on sex education, like, for example, on homosexuality, like, for example, on women in the church, celibacy. So, they now say that when they raised those issues, they did so as a goodwill gesture, and not, in fact, in response to their state party responsibilities. The Committee on the Rights of the Child has said that is untrue. I have to say, this is my area of study, and it's depressing and it's embarrassing to have to say it. I think my church is on a hiding to nothing here. It has manifestly changed tack. It has adopted a position that it regards as tactically suited to the moment. It is going to pay a very dear price for it. It has even threatened to withdraw from the treaty. Let it try that now. No. Let it try that now. So, you see, the Committee on the Rights of the Child has no power. The only power it has is the power of embarrassment. It can't say to a state party or a country or the church, you must do this. What it says is, look, do you see what you're doing there? That contradicts the principles. We think you should change that. Corporal punishment's the obvious one, very obvious one. Our church still teaches that corporal punishment is okay, that the reasonable chastisement of children by their parents, and those in loco parentis, which would include teachers, may I say, is perfectly, not only acceptable, but actually necessary. If you read the Catholic Catechism, you won't find it in canon law, you'll find it in the Catholic Catechism. And interestingly, in order to support that view, they can't find anything from the New Testament, because there isn't anything in the New Testament. They have to go all the way back to the book of Sirach to get that awful chapter that talks about beating his loins till they bleed. We translate it nowadays as, spare the rod and spoil the child. That's roughly it. They go to the Committee on the Rights of the Child, and they specifically deny that the Church advocates corporal punishment. They fail to say what is written in plain black and white in the Code of Canon Law. Now, you and I both know that in Catholic schools nowadays, nobody beats anybody in Catholic schools, not here, not in Ireland. Those days are gone. Parents don't do it anymore because that's also, our law in Ireland has changed, thanks to the Committee on the Rights of the Child, it has changed. But the truth of the matter is, it's still there. Still there in our church teaching. Why? Because we have failed abysmally at the level of church governance to say to ourselves, let's have the discussions that we've been talking about, let's have the dialogue, let's have the debates about what we need to do to bring all of our internal sphere to do in our backyard what we tell everybody to do externally. Because the church is great at speaking out to the world, but not so good when it turns its mind to its own backyard.
Well, Mary, that's a very salutary moment to end on, I think, this part of the dialogue. What I'd like to do first of all is to thank you for your extraordinarily comprehensive look at what's going on both within the church and without. It's such a massive, massive area of discussion, gender and Catholicity. We've ranged over a very, very far-reaching sphere.
Just for clarification, you referred quite a lot to the idea of the human person being body, and so on. But could you just describe to me what the attributes of the human person are? What makes you human in the eyes of the church, or in your own eyes, or whatever? Because it seems to me this is the crux of an awful lot of this debate.
Well, if you look at the body of Catholic teaching and tradition, it would say that we are made up of body, soul and spirit, and that they are not separate from one another, or at least they are separate from one another in that, at some point we will leave our body behind, in this earth, but the person that I am, the unique created person that I am, continues to live within eternity. Therefore, I think part of what the document that I was referring to at the very beginning is concerned about is any sense that somehow your body is merely incidental to who you are, and that therefore your gender, your own history, your own personal history, where you belong within your family, your whole identity is predicated on a historical reality, but also on a physical reality. And it tries to move away, and it sees, I think, in some of the current gender ideology, a tendency to a kind of dualism that says, well, your body doesn't really matter terribly. You can choose to be who or what you like, irrespective of your physical reality. And there would be an argument within Catholic teaching against that as being something that is actually trying to sort of separate out what is an integrated reality. That's as simple and as short as I can make it. Is that helpful?
It certainly helps to put into context what you were saying. Of course, it always begs the question, if the human body is not incidental, if it is part of what defines you as a person, then really nobody has much right to say whether you're going to be gay, straight, or whatever. And I understand that sexuality is a complicated business, but if the human body is so intrinsic to our being, well, I don't know, let's love all of it is, I suppose, a very simplistic way of putting it, and you cannot separate it out, and it is not a matter of will, whether you are gay or not, and it is what God made you.
Actually, I think that's a really important point, because one of the things I got from the document, and this is why I wrote to Bettina, because I'm not sure that my interpretation is correct, but it seemed to be saying, man and woman, he made them. The family is based on men loving women, women loving men, and producing children together. It does talk about surrogacy, and it talks about other means of producing children, more mechanical means, it also makes the point that even with those mechanical means, you still need a man and a woman. There's almost kind of a triumphalism in the way in which that's said in the document, like kind of got you there. But it also, in the unenumerated things in the document that bothered me, it seemed to be saying that what God wants is for men only to love women and women only to love men. Now, speaking as somebody, I'm married 40 odd years to my husband, and I've been in love with him since I first saw him when I was 17, with a huge passion. And he tells me anyway, he feels the same way about me. And I think that's a wonderful gift. And I say to myself, I've never been attracted to anybody of the same sex as myself. What is it like if someone like my son tells me that he feels that same passion that I feel for his father, but he feels that for another man? And who am I to say, but oh, hang on a minute, you better get a girlfriend, or just to keep the church happy, or you must live a life of celibacy without the joy of a partnership, a lifelong partnership, like I've had with his father for 40 odd years. I don't want my son to live the life that my brother did. My brother's in his 60s. He belongs to the generation that lived the quiet, celibate, sad, lonely life. Is that really what God wanted for my brother? Honestly, I don't believe it. And if that's what God wanted if the God I believe in wanted that for my brother, yeah, I'm not terribly convinced by that God. I know that the church demands it of him, but I see the intervention here of a human view of sexuality, which nowadays we all know has got us into a lot of trouble, and is not soundly based. And one of the things that's absent from this document is science, is psychology, is psychiatry, is medicine, is the lived experience of the people of God, parents like me, children like my son, people like my brother, trying to explain their place in the universe, in a sense held in this bunker of faith in the Catholic Church, but having huge difficulty in reconciling the image of this wonderful God who gave them the nature that they have, but doesn't want them to use the nature that they have. So that's my problem.
I wonder if I can actually put the acting dean on the spot on this. Having himself, like me, been a university chaplain and dealt with many of the complexities of human relationship, and yet trying also to give young people the tools to make some good decisions about how they live and how they love in accordance with the Church's understanding of God's desire for human beings living in love. This is a complex issue, but I wonder, Alban, what you would have said yourself to young people, to students asking these kinds of questions.
I'd say it would be caritas Deus ibi est.
Yeah. God is love.
Excellent.
And anyone who lives in love lives in God, and God lives in them. I think that is the first principle. It is complex how we work that out, but that, I think, is an unbreakable principle given to us certainly implicitly by Christ himself. Wherever there is love, wherever 2 or 3 are gathered in his name, there he is in the midst of them. And there is something immensely important to understand about that.
I think we can make it more complex though than it actually is, to be honest. At least for me, I think back to last year when the Pope came to Ireland to attend the World Meeting of Families. The World Meeting of Families, many of you will know, an organisation set up under John Paul, the brainchild of a man called Cardinal Alfonso Trujillo from Colombia, And I don't know if any of you have read the early documents that came out of the World Meeting of Families, the many catecheses and the documents written by Trujillo himself. Extraordinarily homophobic, dreadfully homophobic. Why? Because the World Meeting of Families was a gathering of a body of people to try and counter the secular tide that was overwhelming the church, that was anti-church, anti-family, pro-divorce, pro-abortion, gay rights. They were all lumped together as an army loaded with ballistic missiles aimed at the church and its value system. Cardinal Trujillo, the great anti-gay advocate, was himself gay, gay homophobe, almost a classic. You meet them regularly in the church, particularly at higher levels. People who are fake heteros, they are fake, they are homophobic, and their homophobia is designed to cover up the fact that they're fake heteros. The old me thinks he does protest too much, but in his case in particular, any of you who have read James Allison's articles in the early part of summer last year on the issue of homosexuality and its impact at the teaching level of the church, he's addressed this particular kind of this syndrome of the fake hetero, who's generally also hugely misogynistic and homophobic, but who's also gay and very often living a decadent life within the gay community. Trujillo meets all of those. He was a card-carrying, sadomasochistic user of rent boys. And yet he, like so many, realized, as they do, that the best form of protection and also the best way of guaranteeing promotion very often in the church is to be the advocate for the ultra orthodoxy. Anyway, the World Meeting, he's long dead of course, he's dead 10 years now. The World Meeting of Families continues every few years under the auspices of the Dicastery for Family, Laity and Life. So it came to Ireland last year, and the Pope came not on an open pastoral visit to the people of Ireland as John Paul had done in '79, but specifically to the World Meeting of Families. So, in the initial catechesis, my original thought when I saw they were coming to Ireland was, this is an opportunity for us now to showcase, in the wake of our same-sex marriage referendum in Ireland, which was overwhelmingly carried by a population that is also overwhelmingly Catholic, this is an opportunity for our church to showcase this "who am I to judge," this welcome for everyone, even allowing for church teaching that all would be welcome. So I was asked to help with the catechesis, and I did. And it went out to the public, beautiful document, and it mentions, it uses two extracts from Francis. In both cases he talks about the family as no longer conforming to the, sort of the old biological metric of mom, dad, married in the church, together for 50 years, but rather the family has many manifestations. And it mentions gay parents, using Francis's own language. It was a really beautiful catechesis, and I was so looking forward to attending the World Meeting of Families with my family. And then the catechesis was withdrawn. All references to gays and indeed to single-sex parents, single-sex marriages, to all references to single parents as having families, they were all withdrawn. It would have been better had they not been put in the first place. Because the fact that they were put in raised hopes and expectations. The fact that they were taken out gave us to understand very clearly that the agenda that you have described, of being, of loving and welcoming and not to create homophobic conduits or excuses, actually there are people actively working against that, who are cardinals, who are working in the Curia, who have control over events like the World Meeting of Families, among whom, let me say very clearly, I do not count my own Archbishop in Dublin. He was stuck with it. It was landed, he didn't ask for it, didn't want it, it landed on his desk. So, but he did his very best, and his very best. But in the end of the day, this is what happened. And the gay the gay population, the gay Catholics, and people like me, I felt I couldn't go then, I couldn't go without my son, and I couldn't go without my brother, and I didn't want to go without them. I would have felt that in some way I was collaborating with the removal of all mention of them from the catechesis, just to flatter church teaching and to flatter a cohort in the church who simply will not engage in the very dialogue that you say we absolutely need and must have. So I think we can complicate it, and frankly I think they did.
And that this document actually says we must have. So somewhere along the line, our rhetoric has to catch up, does it not, with our reality?
Absolutely. Say it out, there are quite a number of people writing in this field at the moment, canon lawyers and theologians, saying that the church is at a crossroads in this regard now. And it really has to take the language of rights, the human rights. When I'm talking about human rights, I'm talking about rights that come from being human, that were given to you by the God who made you and loves you. And it's got to take those, and it's got to do what it advocates to the world at large, respect them. It's got to take it back into its own backyard and show in every way humanly possible that it respects them. That is true of women. It is true of LGBTI people. It is true of so many issues in the church, particularly true of children in the church. It's got to now have the engaged debate about what happens internally in our family that is the communio of the church. And there's no use appealing to say, here's the rule, and we must submit with humble submission to our sacred pastors, because that humble submission and that obedience is based on trust. And honestly, at the highest level, they have betrayed that trust, and they have betrayed it with our most precious thing, our children. Do I trust them? No. And I will insist on them rebuilding that trust by having this dialogue.
I'm going to just see if there is anyone else who has a question, a comment. There are two, three in fact, so I'll take one and one at the back and Jan at the end.
Thank you for the conversation. The Catechism of the Catholic Church says that in matters of faith and morals, the Church teaches infallibly. And then, of course, we have John Henry Newman and development of doctrine. But then we have John T. Noonan, who wrote a book called A Church That Can and Cannot Change. And most of the examples were the way the church did change. And one of the things that I think he said that it was that it changes out of a deep sense of empathy. And usually when the church can and cannot change, there's a kind of tension there, and it's out of that creative tension that something new and novel comes forth. That seems something beautiful comes forth from that. You've talked a lot about how the church has changed and places where the canon law certainly needs to change. I'd like to hear a bit on the part where it cannot change, and where is the creative tension there between where it can and cannot, and where is that part of it coming into this?
I think that's an interesting question, because that I know of, certainly within the Catholic Church and within the Catholic Academy, which has been pretty cauterized really since John Paul onwards, I don't see major debates on what I would call core doctrinal issues that will be covered by infallibility. I didn't see any particular big problem with that until the issue of women and the exclusion of women from ordination. And it was Benedict who really almost gratuitously didn't just suggest, but nudged in the direction closely of saying that the exclusion of women from priesthood is governed by not so much ex cathedra infallibility, but rather by the infallibility that comes from the sensus fidelium. I have difficulty with that, because the sensus fidelium is actually working in a completely different direction. Now, I'm a person, I honestly couldn't care less that they never had women priests. I don't accept the teaching that says that women are excluded, whether infallibly or fallibly, from the priesthood. But neither here nor there at the end of the day. I mean, very few people are joining the priesthood anyway, and I imagine if tomorrow morning they let women in, you get a trickle of women in the same way we've got a trickle of men. So it's not the issue, it's not the big issue of the day. The big issue for me is, if you are going to exclude women in perpetuity and say that that is as close as damn it to an infallible doctrine from priesthood, then you also have to say, what's a consequence of that? Well, a consequence of that is that because decision making is filtered through priesthood, you're now also excluding women in perpetuity, as you are, of course, the laity generally, but women in particular, from incorporation into decision making. And time and again, from Patron and Terrace onwards, popes have said women need to be involved in decision making in the church. And I'm asking them back, okay, fine, do it then. Show us how. Are you going to invite them to synods in large numbers? Are you going to invite them to be, supernumeraries in the College of Cardinals? Are you going to invite them to be part of episcopal conferences? Tell me how you're going to involve them. Still waiting to hear the answer to that. Because why? We've never had a discussion on it. We're all discussing it. We discuss it wherever two or more are gathered, of course. But actually, where the decisions can be made, the discussion is not being had. And I think that's a big worry for me. I don't see doctrinally what I would call the core the beauty of the church. The story of Christ, the story of his birth, the story of his ministry, the story of his resurrection, the glory and majesty of his crucifixion and resurrection. I don't hear people challenging the infallibility of that wonderful teaching. What I do hear them saying is, you're now telling us that the exclusion of women from priesthood is an infallible doctrine. Now that's a big. That was a big problem for me. And when I read that, I immediately wrote to the Pope and said, I've got a problem now, because as an infallible doctrine, I can't accept it.
You never got as far as saying entirely as saying.
No, I'm afraid it does. It comes as close as damn it. Sorry, it does.
It's close, but no cigar, I think.
Yeah, it close as damn it, and that's the problem. I mean, I wrote to the Holy Father at the time, and I got a letter, and I said, look, I have a problem. I have 3 children, and I'm doing what I think is right. I'm raising them. I sent them to Catholic schools, as canon law tells me I must. I try to teach them, or until the homophobia in one of their schools sent them to an Anglican school. I sent my children, I try to raise them in the faith, knowing that my role is to guide and support them, and honouring my right to baptise them and my obligation to do so. But I have no right to impose on them. And so I cannot impose on them views that I myself do not believe. So I've got a problem here. How am I going to handle this? And I got the loveliest letter back, not from the Pope himself obviously, but from somebody down the line writing on his behalf, saying that if you can accept that this is what the Pope, if you can accept merely that this is what the Pope teaches, then I think it's enough that you do that, that I accept that the Pope has a right to teach, which I do, but I don't have to accept the authenticity of that teaching. I'm entitled to express a different view. Now that was then, that was 20 more years ago, almost probably 30 years ago now. I don't think I would get that same letter today. I don't think so. I think I'd be told you're now, because I believe firmly, when I look at the Code of Canon Law says that in those circumstances, I place myself outside the church. I'm excommunicant, but you don't need a process. There's no tribunal as such, because the church doesn't have them to deal with these things. You are now excommunicant, and so I have a really big problem with bringing up the big guns in infallibility in this circumstance, particularly on the gender issue. As you said, there is still a kind of an ambivalence. Did the church actually? Clearly, no Pope has enunciated it as an infallible doctrine from the Pope. But there are different types of ways in which doctrines can become infallible, and the sensus fidelium, the tradition of the church, is one of them. I mean, there are many, many serious doctrines in the church that have never been pronounced infallible. How many infallible doctrines have we had? Two. Yeah. So that's, for me, when you start to bring up those big guns, as they did. I remember writing about it in the time and saying the day they decide that there's going to be women priests, the doctrine of infallibility will probably fall the next day. And that's the danger of having people in charge of the church who are not thinking towards the longer term of the damage they're doing by, if you like, engaging in tactical stuff, the same kind of stuff that's going on with the Committee on the Rights of the Child, not thinking through the impact in the longer term.
Mary, I'm going to ask the last two people who have questions to pose their question, because otherwise I think people's tongues are going to start hanging out for that drink and canapé. So there was somebody behind you, and then Jan. Oh, was it here? Sorry.
Thanks, William, for such an open discussion. I was struck early on when you were talking about Catholic teachings that are true and Catholic teachings that are false. So my slightly wild general question is, how do we know what is true and how do we know, which are false? Because it seems arguments from authority don't work, but neither do arguments based on whatever matches the prevailing moral climate. They don't work either.
That's a good question. But I do think that the sensus fidelium is a very important element of testing. It's the reception of doctrine. There's a wonderful theologian, also a canon lawyer, who writes very well about this, and in his book on the reception of the council. It's a Hungarian teaching in Georgetown. Ladislav Larry Orsi. And his really very incisive way of dealing with this is to say, listen to the voice of the faithful. After due reflection on these issues, what are they saying about them? The example that he gives and often talks about is Humanae Vitae, which very, reasonably quickly after it was in relation to the use of artificial contraception for the limiting of families, almost within a generation, the church, the practice of the faithful had changed, and he's saying you've got to listen to that, because the sensus fidelium is saying we're not receiving this teaching, and if the teaching is not received, and even canon law acknowledges this, that the reception is an important part of the vindication or the validation of the authenticity of a doctrine. I think in my own case, I'm the oldest of 9 children. My mother and her siblings, between them, she's one of 11. They had 60 children because my family thought they had to increase, multiply and fill the earth all by themselves, and came close to it. And but then I look at the next generation, the post-Humanae Vitae generation, and none of us has any more than 3 or 4 children. So there's a huge sea change, and in that sea change there is a message to the church, but the vehicles for expressing that message within the church's structures are very poor. They're very poor. Where are the conduits for the sensus fidelium to have its voice? Where are they? We've had one diocesan synod in Ireland in one diocese. That's the only one we've had since the Second Vatican Council.
So more of these kinds of meetings possibly. One more, and then I will finish with Jan Lash, I think. Thank you.
Well, I'm very much a lay Catholic. I don't know very much about canon law, anything about canon law. I'm a cradle Catholic as well. But I was young at the time of the Second Vatican Council, and I was enormously hopeful at that time, and of course subsequently quite disappointed how things haven't really developed as perhaps I hoped at that time. I'm in my mid-70s, so this business of gender, I think it's all happened so quickly. And with grandchildren, for example, some of the suggestions now in primary school with regard to teaching or with regard to bringing ideas forward, that I think some of my friends in our generation are worried because we've all experienced in our lives, I think, divorce and children suffering and many difficulties, and I think things have become so they've changed so quickly that it's very hard for people of my age to keep up with it.
I agree. You're right, so many things do seem to run out of control, but I'd also go back to what was taught in schools and what Catholic teaching would insist should be taught in Catholic schools. And I think of all the people who, certainly in my country, lived lives of dreadful loneliness and desperate self-doubt, afraid to express who they were in their human nature, precisely because of that teaching. And that should teach us something. That should tell us something. In the same way that children who were abused were unable to express themselves until they got to adulthood, and now we know the damage that does to a life, how it constrains a life and constricts its potential. So I think that part of the debate that we need to have is about the information we give our children. We are the responsible adults around here, and the children have a right to expect from us that we give them responsible information, but that we don't skew the information polemically in one direction or another, either to flatter the magisterium of the church or to flatter some mad gender ideology, but rather we give them the tools that will help them and support them to grow humanly and to grow healthily. And so I think that's and you're right, I mean, a lot of this stuff now, particularly the access that they have through social media, through internet, through a range of tools now that I certainly feel completely overwhelmed by as a grandparent. But that doesn't absolve us from the need to be clear that we are entitled to be involved in this debate. We're entitled to be involved, particularly as educators, in what kind of information. And part of it involves saying to the church, some of the ways in which you approached this in the past was wrong and wrong-headed, and it caused damage. We've got to learn from that. In the same way that if we follow the extenuated argument on gender ideology, we'll also create problems for our children. If we tell them early on in their lives, this is all about free choice. Yeah. So I think we need to bring this debate into the middle. I think it's a really tough debate. Honestly, I do. I think it's really difficult, and it's not helped. Honestly, it's not helped by a church that looks hypocritical in this regard.
But I think my generation have tended to go our own way, without speaking out, possibly.
Maybe we should talk more.
Yeah, with regard to women priests, many of my friends would be in favour of women priests within the Catholic Church. Married priests as well. We don't talk about it, except amongst ourselves. But I think that the loneliness of celibacy is an enormous problem. I don't think that, I hope that the church will allow both. I mean, there's scope for both. To be celibate if you can do that, or to be married if you can't, and don't want to be. And I think that it needs to be talked about.
But where does that happen in the church? Let's look at, if for example the Pope tomorrow decided that he wanted to have a major discussion on this issue and to be advised, let's say, on the issue of women in priesthood, or even just the issue of women and their involvement in decision making in the church. One of the few tools that is available in the church is the synodal system, the calling of the Synod of Bishops, a new phenomenon since Vatican II, not out of Vatican II, but since Vatican II. It's an initiative of Paul VI, sometimes mistakenly regarded as an initiative of Vatican II. It was not. It was designed to thwart the initiative of Vatican II to ensure that it was a much more circumscribed thing than the bishops wanted. But you have the Synod of Bishops, and I mean, the very idea that he would convene, as he has done twice now, since Francis came in, 3 times since he came into office, we've had the 2 synods on the family. We had 1 synod on youth, October gone past. October was in March gone past. Anyway, whatever it was, recently gone past. We had the 2 on the family. And just think for a moment, you convene a synod of 350 males, celibates, most of them, who are going to advise the Pope and deliberate on the role of women in the church. And it's ludicrous. It's bonkers.
To fill in a form and
give our opinions.
Yeah.
And I got
Because
some.
we are
It's
getting
different
right
to deal with
I
this,
would like
definitely.
to invite Jan Nash, who's very patiently been waiting. Have you
What Mary was saying just earlier really was what I was going to talk about the need for moral education, which takes us right back to what you were saying right at the beginning.
Thank you, Jan, and I think therefore that's probably an excellent moment on which to end. Mary, this has been a very wide-ranging conversation. I doubt if many people in the room have heard such a broad spectrum of thoughts conveyed with such passion and such feeling. I wish that the echoes of what you said could be heard in the halls of the Vatican. Clearly they have been in some respects, and your letter is on its way even now. So one hopes that there will be more voices like yours inviting us to dialogue, to discussion, and to moving forward on these very crucial issues. Mary, thank you very much.
Thank you.